Okay, hi, I'm Michael. Happy to be here. Thanks, Marco, for hosting. I will give a talk about advanced Ember deployments with ember-cli-deploy. You can find me on the internet via my handle level was Mike. I'm an Ember.js consultant, so if you have any challenges with your Ember projects that you need to have fixed or just some help on your projects, I'm happy to assist you. And I'm also on the ember-cli-deploy core team. And quick show of hands, who of you has actually used ember-cli-deploy for deploying the Ember applications? Okay, great stuff. A little bit surprising, but maybe this talk will give you ideas that it's actually a good idea and you definitely should be using it. So for everybody who doesn't know too much about ember-cli-deploy or how it actually works, a quick overview. Ember-cli-deploy gives you a single interface for deploying your Ember applications, and that single interface is, of course, the deploy command. Because ember-cli-deploy is an ember-cli add-on, it can register commands and it registers the deploy command for you. And the idea behind ember-cli-deploy is that it structures your deployment into a deploy pipeline, which consists of several pipeline hooks that get executed in sequence. And to configure your deployment or customize your deployment, you can install other ember-cli add-ons that are also ember-cli-deploy plugins, which then register functions that will get run when the pipeline executes the pipeline hooks. That's quite a mouthful, but in essence, it's actually a simple concept, and you can see that in the slide that I put up. We have 4 deployment plugins installed in that example. We have the build plugin installed, the revision data plugin installed, the S3 and the Redis plugin, and the yellow bar in the middle of the animation shows the pipeline. So when you actually execute the deploy pipeline, the pipeline hooks will be executed in sequence. And here you can see that at first the configure hook runs, which leads all plugins to execute their configure function. Then the build command on the build hook will actually build the application. Further down the pipeline, the revision data plugin will actually tag the build, and then in the upload hook, the S3 and the Redis plugins will be used to or will upload the build application artifacts. In the case of S3 to the AWS S3 blob storage, and then in the Redis case, the Redis plugin will take the index HTML that was built by ember-cli and store that in Redis so that your server can then access it later on when users are actually accessing your page. That's the deploy pipeline, but actually ember-cli-deploy registers 3 pipelines: the deploy pipeline, the list pipeline, and the activate pipeline. The deploy is used to actually upload files. The list is used to actually be able to show the available revisions of your application. And the activate pipeline can be used to activate or switch around revisions that have been uploaded before. And the nice thing with this approach now is that whenever you need to do some super crazy custom stuff, it's actually pretty easy to add that to your deployment, because the only thing that you need to do is to just write an ember-cli add-on, which is also an ember-cli-deploy plugin, and just register functions on the respective hooks that will get executed, and then you can do whatever you want, because we're in JavaScript land, and we can do whatever we want in JavaScript. Also, ember-cli-deploy comes with a huge ecosystem. There are already a lot of available and pre-configured deploy plugins available. This picture is actually a few months old, so it shows 99 add-ons. Right now, we have more like 120 plugins. Yes, it's a huge ecosystem, but with that, it's also a huge thing to wrap your head around. So in this talk, I just want to give you an overview about best practices, stuff that people usually tend to struggle with when using ember-cli-deploy, and I will show you that it's actually pretty easy to overcome those challenges. The things that I want to talk to you about today are 5 different things: notifying web service, how we would do that during a deployment, then static versus dynamic deployments. The third thing, staging deployments, is most likely the most important thing that I'm going to talk to you today about, because that's the thing that most people get wrong when they start out. With staging deployments, it's actually pretty easy to do, but it's not too intuitive. Also, in repo add-ons, I will give a quick overview about what you can do with them and in the context of a deployment. And the last thing is the thing that I'm most excited about today, and that's fastboot add-ons are now available from the core team, and you can actually use ember-cli-deploy to deploy your fastboot apps as well. Getting started with notifying web services. You might want to notify third-party services during a deployment. The most important thing for most people, most likely, is just notifying some kind of chat channel to let the rest of the team know that a deployment has been initiated. You might also want to notify some monitoring service that that you're now serving a new revision to your customers. And the bottom line of this slide is actually if you want to if you need to do some more complex stuff like uploading files someplace or complex stuff like that, you should most likely write your own plugin for that. But if you don't want to do nothing more than just notify a webhook, like it's the case from a lot of services, you are best off using an add-on by Simple Labs. Thanks, Marco. And it's called ember-cli-deploy webhooks, and you should definitely be using that instead of writing your own plugin when you don't want to do nothing else than just ping another web service. Here's an example of deploy configuration that makes use of the webhooks plugin. Webhooks comes with several services built in, but it also provides a nice DSL to notify arbitrary HTTP services. In this example, you can see we are registering the Slack provider, and we are sending messages on the did activate hook, which will run when you actually switch the active revision of your deployment, so when users actually see a new version of your app. And we're also sending a message on did deploy, which is the case which will fire when you actually uploaded files. And internal stakeholders may preview your newly deployed revision, but your default users won't see a new version of your app. I also put this slide up because it shows you that I have helper functions that I'm using inside of the config deploy.js file. And deploy.js is actually a JavaScript file for a reason, so you should definitely be using the whole power of JavaScript inside of your deploy configuration. It's just a nicer way to keep things clean and easy to read. So you should definitely be using function inside of your deploy.js if you need to do some complex stuff.
And is not defined, by the way.
Sorry, what?
The variable m is not defined.
Defined? That might be some copy and paste error, but if you use the right syntax, it actually works. Then, are there any other questions about this? Okay, going forward, static versus dynamic deployments. There are two kinds of ways that you can actually deploy your application, leaving alone fastboot for now. You can either take the index.html that ember-cli builds for you when you run the ember build command and put it into some kind of blob storage and serve that, put a CDN in front and serve that directly to your users. Or you can use the dynamic approach where you take the reference of the build artifacts that you need to serve to your users, the concatenated JavaScript files and the concatenated style files. Use references to those and build up the index.html that you're serving to your users yourself. That might be useful in some situations, and here's a quick overview of overview of when you want to use both of these approaches. The static approach, in my opinion, is a nice way to get started with Ember deployments, because it's just super easy to get done. You just take the index HTML that you would have built anyway. It's basically the same thing when you're developing your Ember application. You just boot up the index HTML file. All the relevant assets are referenced inside of there, and the application boots up. You can use that for production deployments as well. Just put the index HTML somewhere, put a CDN in front, and you're good. That's really nice if you have a clear separation between your client and your API. You just treat your Ember application as like you would treat an Android or an iOS application. And it's the super nice thing about this is it's basically free hosting, because it's super cheap to host a file on or host multiple indexed files on Amazon S3, for example, and just put a CloudFront in front. Yeah, that's actually a nice way to do it, in my opinion. You might also need to do some more complex stuff. You might be running a legacy application and you want to build the next feature with Ember, but you don't want to use the old global way of embedding Ember into your application with this Ember global. You want to use the whole Ember CLI ecosystem, and if you use this dynamic approach, you can definitely do that. Because your server serves the index HTML up, you can do some you can decide on what revision of your application you actually want to show a user based on some information of the user or whatever. So that's nice for A/B testing, and you actually need to do that if you want to do A/B testing, unless you use some smarter CDN like Fastly. But Fastly is pretty expensive. The most important thing about this slide is that if you go the dynamic route, which might be a good idea for your use case, you should definitely be using ember-cli-deploy JSON config. That's just a plugin that takes the index HTML file that ember-cli builds for you and creates a JSON object out of it. You can then take this JSON object, put it someplace, access it from your rendering server again, and build up your index HTML file based on that JSON file, which is much nicer than use this index HTML file, parse it, and inject some arbitrary stuff into it. Also important when you go the dynamic, when you use this dynamic approach, is that you actually should be using the same approach as you're using in production in your development environment. You don't want to use the normal way of developing ember-cli applications, deploy your application to production and hope for the best. You should actually be using the same approach as you do in production in development as well. And that means that every time when your Broccoli build has finished, you actually want to deploy the new version of this application to your development server, right? And most people don't know that, but ember-cli-deploy provides a hook for that, and that or a configuration option for that, and that configuration can be set in the ember-cli build file, which you can see on the left. You just put the ember-cli-deploy configuration object inside there, and you return something other than false from the run on post build hook. And whatever you return from that run on post build config will be used as the ember-cli-deploy will then on every Broccoli build deploy your application, and it will use the value that you return from run on post build as the deploy target of that deployment. You can then use that deploy target to customize your deploy.js file, and in this case we are configuring we're setting some special options for the Redis plugin, and we allow overwriting existing revisions, because usually the Redis plugin doesn't allow that and will throw an error, but the revision key won't necessarily change when you don't commit any changes. So we want to allow that, and we also need to disable some plugins during this development phase. So for example, you have, and disabling plugins of course can be done via the pipeline configuration option, and and in this case we're just disabling the build plugin, because we don't need to build the application on that deploy, because the Broccoli server has already built the application, and we don't want to upload the files to S3 because we are serving locally and we're serving via the Broccoli server. And that's also the reason why you need to set fingerprint options in the ember-cli build file. because you're serving from a different server locally and you need to reference the Broccoli server for your assets, and that's the reason why you need to fingerprint your assets in development as well then. Are there any questions about that? Okay, moving forward. Staging deployments, the most trolley part of this presentation. Most people get that wrong because they look, when the need for a staging system or staging deployment arises, they look into the config environment JS file, and inside of this file you return a function that takes environment as a parameter. And then everybody thinks when they want to do a staging deployment, hey, of course I'm deploying to the staging environment, I need to set the build environment for the build command to staging. But that's super trolley, I agree, but that's really the wrong thing to do and not a style decision. The problem there is that if you do it that way, is that ember-cli doesn't know anything about some arbitrary environment. It just knows 3 environments, and these 3 environments are development, test, and production. So when you think about what you actually want to do in a staging system is that you actually want to mirror production as close as possible. You want to build it the same way, you want to behave it the same way. The only difference of a staging system is that it will most likely be hosted on a different domain, and it will need to use some different application configuration than your production systems. For example, you need to use different API hosts, or you need to use different API keys for several services, or you might want to turn off several specific services altogether because it's just a staging system. The first thing, the different domain thing is pretty easy because you have 3 files that actually are relevant for deployment. You have the config-deploy.js file, which is used to configure your deployment process. You have the ember-cli build file that actually is responsible for customizing the Broccoli build that ember-cli does. And you have the config environment.js file, which is actually used to build up your application configuration. Specifying a different bucket or host to deploy to is pretty easy. That's done in config-deploy.js, and config-deploy.js actually takes a deploy target as an argument, so you're good there. You don't need to do anything special there. But if you want to build up a specific, if you want to, for example, append a specific fingerprint for the staging system, which you would be doing on in the ember-cli build file, you can't do this approach because it's not past the deploy target. But the same goes for the config environment.js file. But the nice thing here when using ember-cli deploy is that when you run a deploy pipeline, ember-cli deploy will set the deploy target environment variable for you, which you then can use to customize the ember-cli build.js file and the config environment.js file. That's a pretty long explanation for something that looks very, very simple then. For example, we have the config environment.js. We're passing the build environment, which is actually different, how your application is built in comparison to where we are actually deploying to. And we're just ignoring this passed-in environment because we're always building production. We then use the deploy target environment variable to actually decide which API server to use in our configuration, and then our staging system will behave correctly. Yeah. Are there any questions about that? Nope. Okay. In-repo deploy plugins. I put that into the talk because oftentimes in the Ember Slack channel, in the sub-channel for deployments, oftentimes people approach us and say, hey, ember-cli deploy is pretty cool, but it's super annoying to have to write a plugin to spin up a completely new Ember add-on, to write a deployment plugin for this super specific thing that I need super urgently in my application. And then they say, hey, we actually want to have a way to execute arbitrary functions while deploying our application, and yeah, there is a way, writing a deploy plugin. But of course, you don't want to create a whole new Git repository for that and spin up a whole new add-on. And ember-cli comes with a a notion to do something like that, and this notion is called in-repo add-ons, which are just normal Ember add-ons that live inside of your application repository in the lib folder. And because ember-cli-deploy plugins are nothing more than just normal Ember add-ons, you can actually create in-repo deploy plugins. And the only thing that you need to remember there, and that goes for every ember-cli-deploy plugin, is that you should be using the ember-cli-deploy base plugin as a starting point. That goes for every ember-cli-deploy plugin. Just because it gives you a nice way to interact with the configuration that users have put into config deploy.js. And then what you need to do is just implement the respective deployment hooks that you want to use and execute functions in these hooks. When do I want to use that? If I need to do some small thing that is super specific to my application, but it also can be used to customize third-party plugins or customize the workflow for third-party plugins that are a little bit lacking. For example, the Sentry plugin is a little bit lacking in that regard, that you don't have a way to. It just will upload your JavaScript assets to Sentry in the way that you have built them. In the default case, these files will be gzipped because you want to serve gzipped artifacts to your users, and Sentry can't deal with gzipped artifacts. So what you can be doing instead is you can create a deploy plugin that moves the build files to a separate folder and then uploads the content of that folder instead of the usual deployment build. Also, in case of a super specific thing, this is an example of a in-repo add-on that I'm using in one of my projects. This add-on just detects if I'm currently deploying a feature branch, and it detects that based on this isDeploying feature branch function, which internally just uses a regex and checks the deployment context, Git branch information, and detects is this branch named like you would normally name a feature branch in that project. If that is the case, then please override the revision key on the deployment context, use that as the revision key, and then also merge the information into the deployment context that we're actually deploying a feature branch. And this information then can then be used by subsequent plugins to customize their behavior, because we now know that we're deploying a feature branch. In-repo add-ons can also be used for sharing deployment information with your application, which is super neat. And this comes from the fact that, as I said earlier, an ember-cli-deploy plugin is also, of course, an ember-cli add-on. And ember-cli add-ons come with their own hooks, which can be used to customize the broccoli build or merge some stuff into the application configuration. And in this in-repo add-on, I'm sharing the revision key that I'm using to deploy the application. I'm sharing that as an environment variable in the will build hook, which will run before the application is actually built, before the application configuration gets created. And then later on in the build process, in the configuration hook, that is an actual ember-cli hook that can be used to merge stuff into the into the app's configuration object. I use that environment variable and add the revision key into the application configuration. I can later use that to report errors to my error tracking service and actually tell the error tracking service, hey, this is this exact revision that has thrown this error. Are there questions about that?
I've got a general question.
Yep.
Does it sort of support the notion of testing any of this stuff? I mean, you're showing lots of code essentially that's custom written.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if it's a very valid question at all, but is there any support for any way of testing all this?
Yeah, sure. ember-cli and ember-cli add-ons are just normal node modules, so you can just test them as normal node code, as you would do with normal node code.
Do you find you need to stub certain things, like if it's I guess it's not really making any Ajax calls or anything during this process.
No, for example, in the deploy plugins that I've written, for example, in the fastboots plugins that I will get into later on, I'm actually testing the real thing. For some other older plugins, we are using mocks. But in the fastboot case, I just wanted to make sure that everything works as expected. And I'm really testing the real thing and the real interaction with S3. The thing there is that the tests are then usually super slow. But yeah, you don't have too many tests in that regard, so it's not too bad. Especially if you're writing an open source library, you can spare 30 seconds to actually have a test run. But this goes for your own custom repo add-ons as well, of course. Now to the last part of this presentation, and the part that I'm most excited about, as I said, there are now official fastboot ember-cli deploy plugins. They work with the fastboot app server project, which is I think also an official project from the fastboot organization, which can be used to serve your fastboot apps. And these deploy plugins work with this server. Right now there's a generic one that does the right thing to actually create a fastboot build and zips it. And there's also one child project, a child plugin that works with AWS out of the box. We're also planning on adding support for Google Cloud Platform. That's coming soon. The only caveat right now is that previews aren't supported. We wanted to get this out to users as fast as possible, but we have plans on adding preview functionality as well, and we want to make use of the serverless node functions that are supported on AWS via Lambda and on Google Cloud Platform via Google Cloud Functions. So that's coming soon as well. The nice thing here is you don't have to change your workflow. Everything works as expected. You just run the ember deploy command. You can list your deployed revisions. You can switch revisions around. Everything works as you would expect. And here you can see the implementation of the fastboot app server, that can actually use an ember-cli, works with these plugins. Fastboot app server comes with a notion of downloaders and notifiers, which are quite cool concept. You install or initialize a notifier that you pass to your fastboot app server, and this notifier will look into some kind of storage system and look for a specific manifest file there. And inside of this manifest file, there will be a reference to the revision that is currently deployed on your fastboot app server. And the notifier just pings this file all the time, and whenever it detects a change, it will ping a downloader that the downloader will then look into the manifest file, see which is the new revision that should be activated, will download the file from some place that is referenced in this manifest file, download the file, initialize the new build, and initialize the fastboot server with a new build, and restart the server so that users are now being served the new version of your fastboot app. That's quite neat and works really, really well. The only thing that you need to actually use that in your Ember projects is you install the usual plugins for doing a deployment, and the fastboot one, the related ones are the fastboot app server and the fastboot app server AWS. That's the only thing that you need to do, and that's literally the only configuration that you need to put into your config deploy.js to actually make this work. You just the S3 config option is just necessary so that you're actually uploading assets, the build artifacts, the JavaScript files, and the style files to S3, and the fastboot app server configuration is necessary to basically go through the whole flow that I just explained. And that's everything that you need to do. With this, everything works out of the box, which is pretty nice. Are there questions about the fastboot integration?
Yeah, kinda. Not the specific thing you explained, but for the use case that I don't want to run Node.js as a fastboot server on the production server, do you have any experience for pre-building the final thing? For so let's say I want for the routes.
You mean pre-rendering HTML based on? Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, there are services for that, and Fastboot is actually the thing that you would use for stuff like that.
Yeah,
if you don't want to run it in production, you could most likely just just
close them and
yeah,
paste them. Yeah, right.
exactly, and just access the Fastboot server locally and then upload the file somewhere place or whatever. So that this could also be an ember-cli-deploy.
I just wanted to know if you have tried this or heard about it.
I've not tried that. I have experience with pre-rendering services. Yeah, but I think Fastboot is exactly the thing for that. So you most likely want to use that instead. Okay. All of what I just said wouldn't be possible without the awesome ember-cli-deploy deploy team. Yeah, really happy to be on that project. Yeah, it's just a great project, and kudos to those guys. And that was my talk. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them right now. If not, just approach me later on. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? No? Yeah?
So work with Glimmer applications yet? Did you try that or anyone?
Yeah, I think I haven't.
Probably repeat the question.
Okay, the question was, does ember-cli-deploy work with Glimmer applications as well? I personally haven't tried that, but I saw a blog post by Robert Jackson that goes into detail. Oh my god, Glimmer applications are so super cool because you can use the whole ember-cli ecosystem, and I haven't tried it myself, but it seems to work. Do you have experience with that, Marco?
I haven't done it, but there's no reason why it couldn't work.
Yeah.
So, because the build artifacts are basically the same thing, just way smaller with Glimmer. So it should work out of the box.
Any other questions?
A very stupid question. You showed the Redis database in the pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly are you storing in the Redis? Is it something like CMSDB or?
No, you're actually, so you just need some, so when an Ember build runs, you create an index.html file that your users need to access to boot up your application. And you can use different storage services to store this build index.html somewhere, and for your users to access it. And in the example that I just gave, Redis is just used as a service where you store the deployment artifacts, and your rendering server then goes into Redis, accesses them, and serves them to your users. But you can use a lot of different storage systems with ember-cli-deploy.
Also use another one.
Yeah.
If you use Redis, it is your specialty.
What I use personally?
That you use Redis is your specialty.
No. It's just there are some people that use Redis. Some people, as I said, use the static deployment approach. Just host on S3 and put a CloudFront in front. But there are different solutions that are very much tied to your needs, and there are a lot of plugins that you can actually use to use different storage systems for deploying Ember applications. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael.